My son stood in that hospital doorway on Christmas Eve, told me he'd be back first thing in the morning, and then he didn't come back at all. Not Christmas morning, not Christmas afternoon, not until the nurse's shift changed twice and a stranger in scrubs had to bring me a second blanket because nobody else was going to. I lay there in bed 4 of the cardiac step-down unit at Miami Valley Hospital listening to carols playing tinny through a hallway speaker, and somewhere around hour 11, I stopped waiting for him to walk through that door. That's the moment that changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter Reams. Everybody calls me Walt. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a production supervisor at a machine tool plant here in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place that made the parts nobody thinks about until they break. I live in Kettering, a quiet little house on Willowdale Avenue with a maple tree out front that my late wife Diane planted the year we moved in. I believed, for most of my life, that if you worked hard, paid your bills on time, and raised your kids right, they'd be there for you when it mattered most. I was wrong about that. Not about all of it, but about one of them. I was dead wrong, and it cost me more than I ever imagined a person could lose while still breathing. What I did once I found out is something my son will remember for the rest of his life. Let me back up. Welcome to Sweet Family Revenge. If you're new here, get comfortable, because this story is going to take you somewhere you don't expect. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from, and stick around, because trust me, the ending is worth it. Diane and I were married 41 years before the cancer took her. Ovarian, stage 4 by the time they caught it, gone in 8 months. That was 3 years ago this past spring. I won't pretend those 3 years since have been easy. The house on Willowdale gets quiet in a way I never got used to. I still make coffee for 2 most mornings out of habit and pour the second cup down the drain before it goes cold. We raised 2 kids in that house. Bradley, my son, is 39 now. Works as a regional sales manager for a flooring distributor out of Centerville. Married to a woman named Courtney, and they've got 2 kids of their own, Tyler, who's 9, and Ashlyn, who just turned 6. My daughter Melanie is 34, works as a veterinary technician over at a clinic in Beaver Creek, raising her daughter Zoe, who's 8, mostly on her own since the divorce 2 years back. I want to be clear about something right up front, because people ask me this in the comments on stories like this one. I loved both my kids the same. I never played favorites, not when they were young, not after Diane got sick, not after she passed. What happened wasn't about who I loved more. It was about who showed up and who didn't when it actually counted. It was the morning of December 24th, cold that year, the kind of Ohio cold that gets into your knees before you've even stepped outside. I'd gotten about 4 inches of snow overnight, and I went out around 8:30 to clear the driveway before Brad and his family were supposed to come by that evening for our usual Christmas Eve dinner. I'd done that driveway 100 times. I was halfway through the second pass with the shovel when my chest started to feel like somebody had set a cinder block on it. Not sharp, just heavy, pressing, spreading slow into my left arm. I sat down right there on the porch steps, snow soaking through my jeans, and I told myself it was probably just the cold air working on my lungs. I've told myself worse lies than that one, but that's the one that almost killed me. I called Brad first. Straight to voicemail. I called again 30 seconds later. Voicemail again. I sat there another minute, maybe 2, chest getting heavier, before I finally called 911 myself, sitting on my own front steps at 67 years old, dialing for an ambulance because my own son wasn't picking up his phone on Christmas Eve morning. The paramedics got there in 11 minutes. I remember because I watched the clock on my phone the whole time, watched it tick past like it was mocking me. By the time they had me in the back of the ambulance, hooked to a monitor that kept beeping in a rhythm I didn't like the sound of, I finally got a text back from Brad. Sorry, at the gym, what's up? I didn't answer that text for 3 days. I want you to remember that text. It matters later. They took me to Miami Valley Hospital, ran me through the cath lab by early afternoon. Steamy, the doctor called it. A mild heart attack, 1 blocked artery, a stent to open it back up. Dr. Okafor, a calm, precise man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, came in after the procedure and told me I was lucky. Another hour without treatment, and lucky wouldn't have been the word anybody used. I remember lying there afterward, staring at the ceiling tiles, doing the math on how long I'd sat on that porch step waiting for a phone call that never came, and feeling something cold settle into my stomach that had nothing to do with the anesthesia. Melanie got there first. She'd been at her ex-husband's parents' place dropping off Zoe for the holiday when I called her from the ER, voice still shaking. She left half a wrapped present sitting on somebody's kitchen counter and drove straight to the hospital. Walked into that room still wearing her coat, snow melting off her boots onto the linoleum, and grabbed my hand so hard I thought she'd bruise it. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you call an ambulance sooner?" "I did," I told her. "I just wanted to try Brad first." She didn't say anything to that. She just squeezed my hand tighter and pulled a chair up next to the bed like she planned on staying a while. Brad showed up around 6 that evening, Christmas Eve, still in his gym clothes under his coat like he'd come straight from there and only stopped by his own house to grab a jacket. He stood in the doorway for a second before he came in, the way people do when they're bracing themselves for something. "Dad," he said, "Jesus, are you okay? I got here as fast as I could." I told him I was stable, that they'd put a stent in, that I'd probably be here a few days. He nodded along, checking his phone twice while I was talking, and I told myself he was just worried, that a man checks his phone when he's anxious. That's all it was. He stayed maybe 20 minutes. "Courtney's parents are hosting tonight," he said, standing up. "We told the kids Santa's coming to Grandma and Grandpa's this year. I can't really back out of that now, but I'll be back first thing tomorrow, I promise." First thing. That was the phrase he used. I held on to that phrase for longer than I should have. I didn't sleep much that night. Hospital beds don't let you. Not really. And every time a machine beeped somewhere down the hall, I came half awake wondering if it was mine. Around 2 a.m., a nurse named Renata came in to check my vitals, quiet and efficient, and when she saw I was awake, she asked if I wanted anything. "Just company for a minute," I said, half joking. She smiled and told me she'd had 3 other patients that night with nobody in the room either. "Holidays are hard on this floor," she said. "People forget that hospitals don't close for Christmas." I didn't know it yet, but I was about to learn exactly how true that was, and exactly how alone a man can be in a room full of strangers who are kinder to him than his own family. Christmas morning came and went. No Brad. I called him at 9. Voicemail. I called him at 11. Voicemail. I texted him around noon, just a simple one, checking in, figured you'd be here by now. Nothing came back. I told myself all the things you tell yourself when you're trying to protect somebody you love from a truth you don't want to look at yet. He's got the kids opening presents. He's got Courtney's family in from out of town. He'll come once the chaos dies down. I want to be honest with you here, because this part isn't easy to admit. Some part of me, lying in that bed watching a fake little plastic wreath somebody had taped to the window, already knew that wasn't the whole story. I just wasn't ready to hear it yet. Around 1 in the afternoon, a food service worker brought my tray, and on it, next to the turkey and the little cup of cranberry sauce, somebody had tucked in a foil-wrapped slice of fruitcake with a paper snowflake taped to the plastic wrap. Small kindness from the kitchen staff, I found out later, something they did for patients who didn't have visitors that day. I ate that fruitcake slower than I've ever eaten anything in my life, because it was the only piece of Christmas anybody had handed me since I woke up in that bed. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because it's the one that stayed with me the longest. A man who spent 34 years providing for his family, sitting alone in a hospital bed on Christmas Day, eating a slice of fruitcake off a stranger's kindness, while his son was 20 minutes away opening presents with people who weren't his blood. Around 4 that afternoon, my phone rang. "Melanie." I could hear Zoe's cartoons playing somewhere behind her, and something in her voice was tight, careful, the way people sound when they're about to ask a question they already suspect the answer to. "Dad," she said, "I just talked to Brad on the phone. He told me you were doing fine and resting, and that you said not to bother coming out today, that you wanted to be alone." I sat there holding that phone for a second before I could get any words out. "I never said that, Melanie. Not one word of it." She went quiet on the other end. "I'm coming right now," she said. "Don't argue with me." And she hung up before I could even try. That's the part that broke something loose in me, more than the missed calls, more than the empty room, more than the fruitcake with the paper snowflake. My son hadn't just failed to show up. He'd told my own daughter a story to keep her away too, so she wouldn't come check on me and see for herself how alone I really was. I lay there running that through my head over and over. Why would a man lie to his sister to keep her from visiting his own father in the hospital? And I didn't have an answer yet. I didn't know it then, but that question was about to lead me somewhere I never expected, and what I found at the bottom of it was so much worse than a missed Christmas visit. "Stay with me," because this is where it starts to turn. Melanie got to the hospital a little before 6, snow still on her shoulders, carrying a thermos of chicken soup she'd made from scratch that morning before any of this happened, back when it was still just meant to be a normal Christmas. She set it on my tray table, pulled the same chair up she'd used the day before, and just sat with me. She didn't ask a lot of questions that night. She just stayed, and every so often she'd reach over and adjust my blanket or refill my water cup. Small things, the kind of things that don't cost anything and mean everything. Around 8, she finally asked the question I could tell had been sitting on her tongue the whole visit. "Dad, why would Brad tell me you didn't want visitors?" I didn't have an answer for her. Not yet, but I told her I intended to find one. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. If you're just settling in with your coffee, grab a seat, because we're about to get into the part of this story that turned my stomach inside out. Drop a comment, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and let's keep going. They kept me 3 more days after Christmas, mostly for observation, mostly because Dr. Okafor wanted to make sure the stent was holding and my numbers were behaving. Brad came by twice more during that stretch. Both visits were short, 15 minutes, 20 at most. Both times he seemed distracted, checking his phone, glancing at the door like he had somewhere else to be. On the second of those visits, the day after Christmas, something happened that I didn't think much of at the time, but I've replayed it in my head 100 times since. He'd stepped out into the hallway to take a call from Courtney, and he must have thought the door was closed behind him, or maybe he just didn't care, because I could hear most of it through the gap. "No, he's fine. They're keeping him a couple more days for observation. That's all." I heard him pause, listening to her on the other end. "No, I'm not going to sit here all day. My parents are hosting tonight, too. We need to be there for the kids." Another pause. "We'll deal with the paperwork once he's home," and thinking straight. It's not like he's going anywhere. I lay there staring at the ceiling, turning that phrase over in my head. The paperwork. Once he's home and thinking straight. What paperwork? I didn't have an answer, and I told myself, the way you do when you're not ready to face something, that it was probably nothing. Insurance forms. Something for the pension office about my hospital stay. I was wrong about that too. They discharged me on December 29th. Melanie drove me home, got me settled, stocked my fridge with soup and easy meals, and stayed the first night on the couch even though I told her she didn't need to. Brad called once that whole week to check in. A 3-minute call where he asked how I was feeling, and then spent most of it talking about a new house he and Courtney were looking at over in the Washington Township area, something about wanting more space now that the kids were getting older. I remember thinking, sitting in my recliner with a heating pad on my chest, that it was strange he had that much energy for house talk, and so little for actually walking through my front door. It was the second week of January when I found the letter. I want to walk you through this carefully, because every detail here matters. I was going through the stack of mail that had piled up during the hospital stay and the week after, mostly Christmas cards and bills, when I found an envelope from the Ohio Machinists Pension Fund, the outfit that's been sending me my monthly retirement check since I left the plant floor 8 years back. It wasn't my usual statement. It was a confirmation notice. Direct deposit banking information updated successfully, effective December 20th. I sat there staring at that letter for a long time, because I hadn't called anybody to update my banking information. Not in December. Not ever. Not since I first set it up back in 2018. I called the pension office the next morning, sat on hold for 18 minutes listening to hold music that sounded like it hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration, and finally got a woman named Sherry on the line. She pulled up my account and confirmed it. Somebody had submitted a change of direct deposit form on December 20th, 4 days before I ended up in that hospital bed, routing my monthly pension check to a new account number I didn't recognize. I asked her how that was even possible without my signature. She told me the form had a power of attorney document attached to it, dated back in October, authorizing a Bradley Reams to manage financial matters on my behalf. My chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the stent. I did remember signing something back in October. I remembered it clearly, actually, because Brad had come by on a Saturday afternoon with a stack of papers, told me it was Medicare enrollment paperwork, said the open enrollment window was closing and he wanted to make sure I had the right supplemental coverage before the deadline. He'd walked me through it fast, flipping pages, pointing at sticky flags where he needed my signature, telling me not to worry about the legal language, that it was standard boilerplate. I trusted him. He's my son. I signed where he told me to sign. I had no idea, sitting at my own kitchen table that Saturday, that buried somewhere in that stack was a durable power of attorney document that gave him legal authority over my financial affairs. I didn't know it yet, but that signature was about to become the most expensive mistake of my life. I called Melanie that night and told her everything. The pension letter, the phone call I'd overheard in the hallway, the stack of papers from October. She went quiet on the line for a long stretch, and when she finally spoke, her voice had an edge to it I'd never heard from her before. "Dad," she said, "I think you need to talk to a lawyer. Today, not next week. I think something is very wrong here." I called my old Army buddy Frank Delgado the next morning. Frank and I served together back in the late 70s, peacetime Army. Nothing dramatic, but we'd stayed close for going on 45 years, and Frank had gone through something similar with his own brother a decade back. A mess involving their mother's estate that had taken 2 years and a lawyer to untangle. Frank listened to the whole thing over the phone without interrupting once, and when I finished he just said, "Walt, you need Grace Whitfield. She handled my situation. She doesn't play games, and she doesn't sugarcoat anything. I'm giving you her number right now, and you're calling her today, not tomorrow." Grace Whitfield's office was in a converted house off Far Hills Avenue, the kind of place that didn't need a fancy waiting room because the woman running it didn't need to impress anybody. Mid-50s, sharp eyes, a handshake that told you she meant business. I sat across from her desk and said something close to what I imagine a lot of people in my position have said before me. "I think my son might be stealing from me, and I need you to help me find out for sure." She didn't flinch. She just pulled out a legal pad and said, "Let's find out exactly what we're dealing with." It took her firm 11 days to put together the full picture, and every single day of that stretch felt like a year. She had a forensic accountant pull the pension fund records, the bank records tied to the new account, and a title search on my house over on Willowdale. What she laid out for me on a Thursday afternoon in late January was worse, so much worse, than anything I'd let myself imagine sitting in that hospital bed on Christmas. The power of attorney document Brad had me sign back in October wasn't forged. That was almost the worst part. My signature on it was real, mine, given freely, because I trusted the man handing me the pen. But the scope of it was broad, financial power of attorney, durable, meaning it stayed in effect even if I became incapacitated. And starting in November, weeks before my heart attack, Brad had already begun using it. Small withdrawals at first from a joint checking account I didn't even know he'd added his name to, an account tied to funds I'd kept as a cushion since Diane passed. Then, on December 20th, 4 days before I ended up on that ambulance gurney, he'd filed the direct deposit change with the pension fund, rerouting my full monthly check, $2,400, straight into an account he controlled. Grace told me that between November and the day we sat in her office, a little over $14,600 had moved out of my accounts and into his. I sat there in that office chair feeling something in my chest that had nothing to do with cardiology. "Grace," I said, "why would he need to do this now? What changed?" She slid a folder across the desk. "There's more, Walt," she said, "and I don't think you're going to like it." Inside that folder was a printed copy of an email exchange her investigator had pulled from public real estate listing records, cross-referenced with the title company's public filings. Brad and Courtney had put in an offer on a house in Washington Township back in November, a $610,000 house with a pool and a finished basement, the kind of place well beyond what a regional flooring sales manager and a part-time dental hygienist could typically afford on their own income, especially with 2 kids and a mortgage already on their current place. Grace's investigator had found records showing Brad had also inquired, through a title company, about adding his name to the deed of my house on Willowdale, using that same power of attorney, under the justification that he was helping his aging father manage his estate more efficiently in case of future health complications. Future health complications. I want you to sit with that phrase, because I did, for a long time, sitting in that office chair. My son had drawn up paperwork to put his own name on my house. Using a power of attorney, I signed thinking it was Medicare forms, weeks before I even had my heart attack, planning for a future health complication that he then got to watch happen right in front of him on Christmas Eve. And instead of showing up for me, he used it as cover to keep taking. He wasn't planning around a hypothetical. He was planning around me, specifically around my age, around the fact that a man my size with my blood pressure and my family history of heart trouble was, in his calculations, a matter of when, not if. I want to be clear about something here, because people in the comments always ask this on stories like mine. I didn't hate my son in that moment. That's not what I felt. What I felt was something colder and quieter than hate, something closer to grief, the specific grief of realizing the person you raised, the boy you taught to ride a bike in that same driveway where I nearly died shoveling snow, had looked at his own father's mortality and seen an opportunity instead of a tragedy. Grace laid out the rest of it plainly. The power of attorney, while legitimately signed, had been used in ways that likely crossed into financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Ohio law, especially given the timing relative to my hospitalization and the scope of what he'd already moved. The quitclaim inquiry on the house hadn't been finalized yet, which was the one piece of good news in that whole folder. We still had time to stop it, but we needed to move carefully and quickly, both, she said, because once he sensed anything was wrong, he'd either finalize the deed transfer or start covering his tracks, and either way, we'd lose our clean shot at making this right. I asked her what our options were. She told me two things needed to happen immediately. First, I needed to formally revoke the power of attorney in writing, filed with the county recorder, effective that same day, cutting off any further legal authority Brad had over anything of mine. Second, I needed to file a police report with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office for elder financial exploitation, because what had already happened, the $14,600 already moved, wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was documented, it was traceable, and it was a crime. I told her I wanted to do both. But I also told her something else, something that had been sitting in my chest since that Thursday afternoon in her office, next to the folder, next to the printed emails, next to the number 14,600 typed out in black and white. I wanted him to understand exactly what he'd done, in front of the people whose opinion he actually cared about, before any of it landed on him through a lawyer's letter or a deputy's knock on his door. I didn't know yet exactly what that would look like, but I knew I wasn't going to let this end quietly, with a signed form and a closed file. Some things deserve a witness. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to get the perfect one, and it was going to come from the last place I expected. It was Melanie, 3 days later, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, who told me about the party. "Dad," she said, "Courtney posted something on Facebook this morning. They closed on the house in Washington Township. They're doing a housewarming, New Year's redo, they're calling it, since they missed actual New Year's while the closing was still pending. It's at the new place. Saturday, the first weekend of February. She's invited half the neighborhood." She showed me the post on her phone. A photo of the new house, wide front porch, a wreath still hanging on the door from some previous owner's Christmas. Courtney's caption underneath about new beginnings and blessings and gratitude for family. I read that caption twice, and something in me went very still and very clear. "Grace," I said on the phone that afternoon, "I want to file the police report and revoke the power of attorney this week, quietly, before that party. And then I want to be standing in that new house on Saturday when they cut the ribbon on their new beginning." There was a pause on the line. She didn't argue with me. She just said, "Let's make sure everything is airtight before you walk in that door, because you're only going to get one shot at this, and I want it to actually stick." We filed the revocation of power of attorney with the county recorder that Tuesday, effective immediately, meaning Brad no longer had any legal authority over a single dollar of mine. Not the pension, not the bank accounts, nothing. Grace also had my banking institution flag and freeze any further transfers tied to the account he'd been using. And she coordinated with a detective in the sheriff's elder abuse unit, a steady, no-nonsense woman named Detective Renfro, who reviewed the documentation Grace's team had compiled and told us, plainly, that this was one of the more well-documented cases she'd seen come through in a while, that the paper trail practically built the case for us. Detective Renfro also told me something I didn't expect. She said that given the amount involved in the pattern of the deed inquiry on my house, this wasn't going to stay a quiet civil matter. This was likely heading toward criminal charges, regardless of what I decided to do socially with my own family. I sat with that for a long moment. Part of me wanted to soften it somehow, protect him from the worst of it. But I thought about that hospital room on Christmas Day, the fruitcake with the paper snowflake, the lie he told Melanie to keep her away, and I let that part of me go quiet. I also had Grace draw up a new will that week. The old one split everything evenly between Brad and Melanie, the house, what remained of my savings, the pension survivor benefits. I told Grace I wanted it changed. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that, because it wasn't spite driving me. It was clarity, the same clarity that had settled into my chest sitting in her office reading that folder. The new will left the house on Willowdale and the bulk of what I had to Melanie. And a portion, not a symbolic dollar, a real portion, went to a scholarship fund through the local VFW post I'd belonged to since I got out of the service, set up specifically for kids of Montgomery County veterans who needed help paying for community college or trade school. I served 3 years. Nothing heroic, peacetime duty mostly, but that post had been good to Diane and me over the decades, and I liked the idea of something good coming out of all this that had nothing to do with my own family's mess. Saturday came fast. I remember standing in my closet that morning picking out a button-down shirt, hands steadier than I expected them to be, and thinking about Diane, about what she would have said if she'd been alive to watch what her son had become in the 3 years since she'd been gone to protect him from himself. I think she would have stood right beside me at that party. I believe that all the way down. Melanie drove me over. She'd asked to come with me the moment I told her what I was planning, and I didn't argue, because some things a person shouldn't have to walk into alone, and because I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that she deserved to see this too, after everything Brad had put her through with that lie on Christmas Day. Grace came separately, in her own car, parked half a block down, documentation folder in her bag, along with a copy of the filed revocation and a summary letter outlining what had already been reported to the sheriff's office. We had agreed, the 3 of us, that she wouldn't come inside unless I asked her to. This part, I told her, I need to do myself. The house in Washington Township was exactly the kind of place you'd expect from that Facebook photo: wide front porch, manicured yard even in February, a wreath on the door, cars lined up along both sides of the street. I could hear the party before I even got out of Melanie's car, laughter drifting out through a cracked window, somebody's Bluetooth speaker playing something upbeat. I stood on the sidewalk for a second, coat collar up against the cold, and I thought about a man sitting alone in a hospital bed on Christmas Day eating a stranger's kindness off a paper plate, and I walked up that driveway. Courtney answered the door, surprised to see me, genuinely surprised, I think, because I hadn't RSVP'd, hadn't even been on the guest list as far as I knew. "Walt," she said, "oh my gosh, we didn't know if you'd feel up to coming. Come in, let me get you something to drink." I told her I was fine, that I just wanted to say a few words to everyone, if that was all right. She smiled, that particular smile people give you when they haven't yet realized the ground under them is about to move, and she called out over the crowd for Brad. The living room was full, maybe 30 people, neighbors I didn't recognize, a couple of Courtney's relatives I'd met once or twice at holidays over the years, Tyler and Ashlyn running around near the kitchen with 2 other kids their age. Brad came around the corner from what I assumed was the new kitchen, a beer in one hand, and when he saw me his face did something complicated, surprise first, then something underneath it that flickered and disappeared fast, something that looked almost like calculation. "Dad," he said, "hey, you didn't have to come out, it's freezing, but hey, glad you're here, come check out the place." I stood in the middle of that living room, coat still on, and I asked if I could say a few words. The room quieted the way rooms do when somebody standing very still asks for everyone's attention. Courtney looked pleased. I think she assumed I was there to offer a toast, congratulate them on the new house, the kind of thing a proud father does. Brad's smile stayed fixed in place, but something behind his eyes had gone still and watchful, the way an animal goes still right before it decides whether to run. "I want to thank everybody for having me," I started, voice steady, because it needed to be steady. "This is a beautiful house. Brad and Courtney worked hard for it, I'm sure." Somebody in the back said something like, "That's right, congratulations," and a few people clapped lightly. I let that settle for a second before I kept going. "But I want to tell you all a story, because I think you deserve to know exactly what this house cost, and I don't mean the number on the closing paperwork." The room went quiet again, quieter this time. Courtney's smile faltered. Brad set his beer down on the nearest table, slow, careful, the way a man moves when he's trying not to draw attention to how fast his heart is beating. "On Christmas Eve," I said, "I had a heart attack shoveling snow in my own driveway. I called an ambulance myself, because my son didn't answer his phone. I spent Christmas Day alone in a hospital bed, and when my daughter tried to come see me, my son told her I didn't want visitors, that I'd said so myself. I never said that. Not one word of it. I looked over at Melanie, standing near the door, arms crossed, jaw tight, and then back at the room. While I was recovering, I found out that back in October, my son had me sign a power of attorney document I believed was Medicare paperwork. And starting in November, before I ever had that heart attack, he began using it. $14,600 moved out of accounts that belonged to me and into one he controlled. And 4 days before I ended up in that ambulance, he rerouted my entire monthly pension check to that same account. Courtney's face had gone pale, one hand rising slowly to her mouth. I heard a woman somewhere behind me whisper something to the person next to her. Brad hadn't moved. "Dad," he said, his voice thin. You don't understand what that money was for. I was going to pay it back. I was just covering the closing costs until my bonus came through in January. I was always going to. You also inquired about adding your name to the deed on my house," I said, keeping my voice level. Keeping it the way you keep your voice level when you've spent a lifetime supervising a factory floor and you know that raising it never gets you anywhere useful. Weeks before my heart attack, planning, in writing, for what your lawyer's search called future health complications. I let that phrase hang there in that beautiful new living room. You didn't just take my money, Brad. You looked at your own father and saw an actuarial table. Nobody in that room made a sound. Somewhere in the kitchen, I could hear Tyler and Ashlyn still laughing about something. Oblivious. The way kids are supposed to be able to stay oblivious to things like this for just a little while longer. "I want you to understand something," I said, and this part one said quieter because it mattered more than any of the rest of it. I already filed a formal revocation of that power of attorney with the county. You have no legal authority over anything of mine as of Tuesday. I also filed a report with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. Detective Renfro has already reviewed the documentation. This isn't a conversation we're going to have at Thanksgiving where everybody agrees to move on. This is already in motion, and it's going to stay in motion regardless of anything either of us says in this room tonight. Brad's face had gone through several colors by that point. Red, then something closer to gray. "Dad, please," he said, "you can't do this to me in front of everyone. We can talk about this. I'll pay it back. All of it, I swear." "I know you'll pay it back," I said. "The law is going to make sure of that part. But I didn't come here tonight to collect a debt. I came here to say something out loud, in front of the people whose opinions clearly mattered enough to you that you were willing to steal from your own father to impress them with a house you couldn't otherwise afford." I looked around that living room slowly, at Courtney's relatives, at the neighbors holding their drinks, frozen, not sure where to look. "I raised him better than this," I said. "His mother raised him better than this. Whatever he's become since she passed, that's not who we taught him to be." I turned back to Brad one last time. "I've also had my will rewritten," I said. "Everything, the house, what's left of my savings, it's going to your sister and to a scholarship fund for veterans' kids through the VFW. Not out of spite, because I trust where it's going. That's all I came to say." I turned and walked toward the door. Melanie fell in step beside me, her hand finding mine the same way it had in that hospital room on Christmas Eve, steady, certain. Behind us I heard Courtney's voice, thin and shaking, saying something to Brad that I didn't catch, and I heard him say my name once, quiet, almost pleading, but I didn't turn around. Some doors, once you've walked through them, aren't meant to be walked back through, not that same night, maybe not ever. Grace was waiting outside by her car when we came down the driveway, breath fogging in the cold February air. She didn't ask how it went. She could see it on my face, I think, the particular stillness that comes after you finally set something down you've been carrying too long. "I'm proud of you, Walt," she said, and that meant more coming from her than I expected it to. The weeks that followed weren't quiet, exactly, but they were clean in a way the previous 2 months hadn't been. Detective Renfro's investigation moved forward with the documentation Grace's team had compiled, and by early March, Brad was formally charged with financial exploitation of an elderly person, a 4th-degree felony under Ohio law, given the dollar amount involved. I want to be honest with you here, because people ask this in the comments too. I didn't feel triumphant when Grace called to tell me the charges had been filed. I felt tired, mostly, and something close to sad. The specific sad of a father who spent 39 years hoping his son would turn out to be the kind of man who didn't need consequences like that to understand right from wrong. He ended up taking a plea deal that spring, restitution in full, The $14,600 repaid over an agreed schedule, plus a suspended sentence contingent on probation and no further contact attempts that Detective Renfro or Grace considered harassment. He tried calling me twice in April. I let both calls go to voicemail. Not out of cruelty. I just didn't have anything left to say that hadn't already been said standing in that living room in Washington Township, in front of 30 people and 2 children who deserved a grandfather they could actually trust. Courtney reached out once, in May, a text message, brief, saying she was sorry, that she hadn't known the full extent of what Brad had done until that night at the party, that she'd had no idea about the power of attorney or the pension. I believe her mostly. I think Brad kept a lot of that from her too, the same way he kept it from Melanie, the same way he'd kept it from me right up until the moment I found that letter from the pension fund sitting in a stack of Christmas cards. I told her I appreciated her reaching out, and that I hoped, for the kids' sake, that Tyler and Ashlyn would still get to know their grandfather, just not through their father's version of things anymore. That door, at least, I left cracked open. Children shouldn't have to inherit the consequences of their parents' choices any more than they already do. Melanie and I have gotten closer this past year than we'd been in a long while. Closer, maybe, than we'd been since Diane got sick. She comes by most Sundays now with Zoe, and we've started doing something I never thought I'd care about, teaching an 8-year-old how to bait a hook down at the pond behind the VFW post. The same way I taught her mother 40 years ago, the same way I once tried to teach Brad, before life got complicated in ways I never saw coming. I still think about that Christmas day sometimes, more than I'd like to admit. The fruitcake with the paper snowflake taped to it. The sound of carols coming tinny through a hallway speaker. The specific silence of a room where nobody comes. I don't think about it with anger anymore, most days. I think about it as the moment I finally saw clearly, for the first time in years, exactly who was standing beside me and who wasn't, and I made my peace with acting on what I saw instead of what I wished were still true. A man spends his whole life building something for the people he loves, and somewhere along the way, if he's not careful, he forgets to ask whether they're building anything back. I know the answer now. I know it in the deed to my house, in the pension check that comes to the right account every month like clockwork, in the will sitting in Grace Whitfield's filing cabinet with my daughter's name on it, and a scholarship fund that'll put some veteran's kid through trade school long after I'm gone. And I know it every Sunday afternoon, watching an 8-year-old girl reel in a bluegill off the dock behind the VFW post, laughing so hard she nearly drops the rod, while her mother sits next to me in a folding chair, and neither one of us has to wonder, not even for a second, whether the person sitting beside us is actually there. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, leave a comment, and let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge, because there are more stories like this one still to come. I'll see you in the next one.